Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Thank you for joining today. So we're going to start with our new weekly meetings on Ibn Khaldun's Muqaddimah, and today we're mainly going to go over the introduction, the first section in the book, which mainly deals with the issues of the nature of history and the nature of the study of history, where the author presents a couple of problems with some historians and the way they approached recording history. And then, inshallah, it will give us a good foundation for our future discussions, where the author goes into more depth regarding the history of the East and the West of the Muslim world, the history, the society, all the problems that he deemed necessary to discuss. So to begin with, I'd like to actually read from the introduction about what Ibn Khaldun actually deems to be the essence of the writing of history. So basically, he says that the writing of history requires numerous sources and much varied knowledge. It also requires a good speculative mind and thoroughness, which lead a historian to the truth and keep him from slips and errors. If he trusts historical information in its plain transmitted form and has no clear knowledge of the principles resulting from custom, the fundamental facts of politics, the nature of civilization, or the conditions governing human social organization, and if, furthermore, he does not evaluate remote or ancient material through comparison with near or contemporary material, he often cannot avoid stumbling and slipping and deviating from the path of truth. So this is what the author says is the prerequisite for writing about history. Are there any examples either from this section or any other real-world examples which deal with the, let's say, the wrong way or an inappropriate way of writing or dealing with history that you can think of?
Like, what do you mean exactly? Like specific instances where history has been explained in a wrong manner, or?
Yeah, so for example, there is an example from the book which the author presents where he says that a lot of historians embellished historical events. They exaggerated figures. For instance, the number of soldiers fighting various wars. And basically they fail to take into account any true historical references and also the nature of societies back in the day. So the example that is given is about the Jewish people in Egypt. Okay.
Yeah, that was very interesting. Subhanallah, especially in the Quran, like in Surah Al-Shu'ara, there's a hint at this, right? Because even when Pharaoh is telling, his people like to go chase the Israelites, he's telling them, like that these are just a handful of people in qalilun, so there's already, I think it's like ayah 50 or 52, I'm not sure now, but there was this reference to them being a small group of people. So even subhanallah in the Quran we have And this differs from the biblical narration, right, where there are like 600,000 men, which means like, I don't know, roughly 2 million people crossing the Sinai Desert and so on, which would have left some print, like some, it would have been recorded in many historical, it would have had great impact, at this time, if this had happened, but that was not the case. And subhanAllah, the Quran, gives us the correct historical narrative.
But yeah, the one of the things that I personally find very interesting is that Ibn Khaldun stresses the importance of understanding how societies functioned back in the day, and the way people lived, how numerous those societies were. And that type of information is very useful at gauging any figures or any historical claims. And he obviously makes a very important point that we cannot really trust the Torah, the Old Testament, because it has been altered by Jewish scribes. So, like for us as Muslims, we obviously take the words of God, of Allah, above everything else. And we don't need, we don't necessarily go the path of secular historians. We think that the words of Allah are the truth, right? But he makes a very important point that the Torah is not really that. It has been altered, so all the figures are wrong. Well, most of them anyway. Are there any examples from this introduction where the author stresses out the importance of understanding how societies functioned back in the day in order for us to understand, any historical claims, anything that you can think of? Or it doesn't have to be necessarily from the book. It can be some of the things you know about.
Well, I think it's quite normal for Western historians to look at history outside of any actual context of the society at the time, of whatever period they're looking at or whatever society they're looking at. They very often take it out of context, and don't actually go to any trouble to try to understand that society from the perspective of the people at that time. They retroactively analyze the society from the value system and from the understanding and the standards of the era that they're living in. I mean, this is a very normal thing. They even have a term for it. I can't think of what it is now, but they have a term for that, where you apply modern day understanding to historical societies, and interpret it. Like, for example, the way that you would interpret, say, rights or oppression or freedom or opportunity or so forth. They operate according to 21st or 20th century standards, and very specifically Western European American standards of and understandings of these types of things. And so they will characterize these societies according to that understanding, and refer to them as, for example, say oppressive or patriarchal or restrictive or primitive or so on, because they're not actually putting it in the context of the time period that it was. I think that's a really important thing that Ibn Khaldun contributed to the understanding of how to analyze history. Unfortunately, I think a lot of historians have not taken that on board in their own way of presenting history. And also, of course, there's the fact that it's not just the Westerners, but for Westerners, we find it very often that they manipulate history for the purpose of present day utilization of narrative. So they create a narrative based on a certain reading, a certain understanding, a certain interpretation of history, for the purpose of propagating that narrative, a current day narrative. They use historical examples, even though those historical examples are taken out of context. So there's a lot of manipulation with regards to how they present history in the West. And again, they're not the only ones who are guilty of this. But this is, I can't give you a specific example of what he was talking about from the book, because unfortunately I haven't had time to catch up on the chapter. But this is certainly something that we see in modern historians and historical books, historical accounts, and there's an even new phenomenon of people sort of just online who are not historians, who are not academics, but they'll hear something about something in history, and then they'll do a blog about it and try to present it in a certain way because they're trying to drive a narrative today, and so they'll use something from the past without actually having any real historical understanding or any context of that society and the understanding of the people at the time and so forth.
Yeah, that's a good point actually, and there are various instances of that happening where, especially when it comes to Islamic history, a lot of these secular thinking historians will cherry pick some instances from the history to make a point about, a good or a bad point about Islamic civilization. The example the author gives, and I'll actually read this very short excerpt, is about okay, I'll just read out loud. He says that another fictitious story of the historians, which they all report, concerns the reason for al-Rashid's destruction of the Barmecides. It is the story of Al-Abasa, al-Rashid's sister, and Jafar bin Yahya bin Khalid, his minister. Al-Rashid is said to have worried about where to place them when he was drinking wine with them. He wanted to receive them together in his company. Therefore, he permitted them to conclude a marriage that was not consummated. Al-Abasa then tricked Jafar in her desire to be alone with him, for she had fallen in love with him. Jafar finally had intercourse with her, it is assumed, when he was drunk, and she became pregnant. The story was reported to al-Rashid, who flew into a rage. And the author then says, this story is irreconcilable with Al-Abbasa's position, her religiousness, her parentage, and her exalted rank. So basically, this is a sensationalist story that some, quasi-historians reported. And Ibn Khaldun says, well, aside from the fact that you don't really have any concrete evidences, it doesn't really make a lot of sense given what we do know about those characters in the past. So, like, his main argument about talking or writing about history is that you need to understand the people you're talking about, you're discussing. You need to know about their histories, their biographies, their nature, their personalities, etc. Which I think a lot of Muslim historians and scholars did very well, as we know from the science of transmitting narrations in our tradition, where we have biographies of the people who transmitted. So we have developed science based on that, and we take we pay a lot of attention to the character, not only not only of the people involved, but also of the people who transmitted that knowledge as well. So we can get a fairly accurate idea, a fairly accurate picture of what exactly and what truly happened in the past. So yeah, this is one example where the author states that this could not have happened because of the character of the people involved. Are there any other examples that we can discuss here that deal with this particular issue?
Good morning, everyone. Did you mean نقل from within المقدمة or generally speaking.
Yeah, it can be from the book or, some other example that you know about.
Well, you can refer to the events reported of the Umayyads, but later on during the Abbasid era. So, um, the history of Islam, as we know it today, was started to be written during the Abbasid period, Al-Tabari and the famous historians that we know of. And there would be reports of the Umayyad rulers doing this and that. And sometimes it would be reported that an Umayyad ruler used to eat 100 sheep a day, for example. I think it was Sulaiman ibn Abd al-Malik, one of the most famous Umayyad rulers. He was the one who was right before Umar ibn Abd al-Aziz, rahimahullah, and this was the guy who they thought was the best of the Umayyads, of course, second to Umar ibn Abd al-Aziz. And so they would report stuff like that he would eat 100 sheep a day and do things like that. So I think this would be something that can be in relation to the point you were discussing, that it could not be, it simply could not be reconcilable that a man could eat, no matter what the man was, could eat 100 sheep a day or something like that. Or that they also reported that the Abbasids would excavate the bodies of the Umayyads and whip them in revenge for what happened to Al-Hussein radiallahu anhu arda. So I do not believe that Al-Mansur would excavate the bodies, or Al-Safah would excavate the bodies and whip them in revenge. There were, of course, massacres, but not to the extent of excavating bodies of the dead, I mean.
Yeah, that's a good point, actually. And I think the author does talk about sensationalism a lot in this introduction. Basically, he says, and I'll quote here, speaking about those stories and historians, he says, there are many such stories. They're always cropping up in the works of the historians. The incentive for inventing and reporting them shows a tendency to forbidden pleasures and for smearing the reputation of others. People justify their own subservience to pleasure by citing the supposed doings of men and women of the past. Therefore, they often appear very eager for such information and are alert to find it when they go through the pages of published works. I mean, nothing has really changed. We have this happening today as well, where public figures get smeared left and right without any concrete evidences. And yeah, I suppose a lot of people like a good, a good gossip. They like, hearing negative, bad things about other people. So it makes sense that historians did that kind of thing as well. Not really paying attention to objective truths, right? Rather getting their bias in the way and basically succumbing to that pressure to get rid of either opponents or people who think differently than them, right? Now, I'd like actually to move on to a related topic, and it has to do with the tools a historian needs to possess in order to recount historical events accurately. So Ibn Khaldun says, the scholar in this field needs to know the principles of politics, the nature of things, and the differences among nations, places, and periods with regard to ways of life, character qualities, customs, sects, schools, and everything else. He further needs a comprehensive knowledge of present conditions in all these respects. He must compare similarities or differences between present and past conditions. He must know the causes of the similarities in certain cases and of the differences in others. He must be aware of the differing origins and beginnings of dynasties and religious groups, as well as of the reasons and incentives that brought them into being and the circumstances and history of the persons who supported them. His goal must be to have complete knowledge of the reasons for every happening and to be acquainted with the origin of every event. Then he must check transmitted information with the basic principles he knows. If it fulfills their requirements, it is sound. Otherwise, the historian must consider it as spurious and dispense with it. So I'd like to ask you then, when it comes to the knowledge um, he mentions the nature of things and the differences among nations, places, and periods. Can we think of any examples where the particular knowledge of a place or of how a particular nation behaves can give us an insight or two about historical events that happened in some area, country, or region?
I mean, I think I knew of something, I read about something, some tribes in Central Asia, they had a very different approach to life. They were steppe tribes, and they would, band their heads you know, tie tie some clothes around their heads ever since they were babies, and so their heads would grow in a very weird shape, and they used to think that this was healthy for them or something, and they also had this weird thing that men would consummate with women regardless of their relationship. From They would consummate with women from a certain age, and they would say that all of the children of the tribe are their children, so that there was equality among them. Of course, it's wrong, but I mean, to them that was perfectly natural, and they didn't see anything wrong with that. And that's how their society used to function. I think the tribe's name was the Heruli or the Eruli. I'm not sure if I remember the name correctly, but I did read it somewhere.
That's from like Central Asia, right?
Yeah,
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah, I did actually stumble upon that a while ago. I do remember. I do remember about that.
that specific tribe.
The custom of dropping their heads into
Yeah, and in relation to that, I think it was mentioned in the history of Herodotus. I just remembered right now that the king of the Persians, he had an envoy from the Greeks and another envoy from India. And the Indians back then, it was their custom to eat their dead. That's how they would use to honor their dead. The Greeks on the other side would burn their dead, and so the Persian king the story goes that he asked the Greeks, "Would you eat your dead?" And the story said that they were utterly disgusted at the mention of the fact, like, why would they eat their dead? And then he asked the Indians, "Would you guys burn your dead?" And they were equally disgusted by the fact that they would burn their dead instead of eating them, because they thought that by eating them they would, revive them in themselves or something. And so, in that particular instance, Herodotus would say that, and thus different peoples have different customs, and custom, I think, is God or something like that. That to each people, their custom is their ultimate belief.
That really made me think of there's a famous lecture on YouTube by that uh, political scientist Roy Casagrande from the US, where he
Yeah,
talks about the Aztecs and regarding the customs. When we are in the 21st century, read about the human sacrifice that they the ritual they performed, naturally we feel disgusted. But then the professor explained, not really excusing the act, but explained the reasons why they did that. How that there was a shortage of animal protein because they didn't really, have enough of it. The diet was, based on corn, right? So, even though it was disgusting, there was still some reasoning behind it, and they did it sparingly, like, once a year. And then he contrasted that to what the Spanish did once they entered the area, and all the massacres and slaughters they committed. And a present day European, that doesn't really think too much about the Spanish and the way they conducted themselves in the Americas. But he or she would have a great contempt and disgust for what the Aztecs did. So it really goes to show that if you want to discuss history, you need to understand and appreciate the civilization you're talking about, and to understand why they did certain things. And I suppose in this instance, the professor employed, or rather took heed of the advice of Ibn Khaldun, right? Anyway,
Contextualization.
yeah, exactly. So that's what I was going with, and you summarized it in one word. Thank you. Another thing that I'd like to discuss, I know I'm jumping from section to section, but there's a lot to cover. There is a section in this introduction where he talks about historical changes and how they occur. Basically, the author discusses this proverb that says the common people follow the religion of the ruler, okay, or the deen, the way of doing things. And he goes on to say, when politically ambitious men overcome the ruling dynasty and seize power, they inevitably have recourse to the customs of their predecessors and adopt most of them. At the same time, they do not neglect the customs of their own race. This leads to some discrepancies between the customs of the new ruling dynasty and the customs of the old race. The new power, in turn, is taken over by another dynasty, and customs are further mixed with those of the new dynasty. More discrepancies come in, so that the contrast between the new dynasty and the first one is much greater than that between the second and the first one. Gradual increase in the degree of discrepancy continues. The eventual result is an altogether distinct set of customs and institutions. As long as there is this continued succession of different races to royal authority and government, changes in customs and institutions will not cease to occur. What do we make of this? How can we understand this?
I'm sorry to interject. History is a topic dear to my heart, so I will be going back and forth with you a lot on this topic, if you don't mind, Natalie.
No need to apologize at all. Right.
So I think it refers to the strength of the conquered peoples, culturally speaking, because if the conquered peoples do have a strong culture, a comprehensive culture, the ruler, who is usually a bit on the, he's not up to date. He and the army are not usually up to date with the sophistications of the city that they just conquered. This is actually something that Ibn Khaldun refers to a lot, the Badawa and the Hadara, like the people of the desert and the people of the city, and that the people of the desert are always they're much more hardened than the people of the city, and they're less sophisticated in terms of the luxuries of life that they are presented with. And so naturally the culture of the city will always be sophisticated, comprehensive, and dominating, even if they were militarily defeated. And so the ruler who comes to rule the city will inevitably have to drown, so to speak, in this dominant culture that he is now ruling, in order to be able to move things about and to shake things about, move, yani, to have the people comply. So in a way, they minimally defeat him by forcing him to comply with their culture. I think an example of that is the Mongols when they conquered Iraq and Iran in the I think it was I always يعني get messed up. I think it's the 13th century, like Hulagu Khan and his descendants. And so they conquered Iraq and Iran, which were deeply, deeply sophisticated Muslim societies that had their own institutions and they had their own ulama and they had their own culture. And so after a while, those Mongols, they had to adopt Islam and they started their own Muslim dynasties. The same thing, I think, could not be said about Egypt or the Levant because they didn't succeed in taking those. So more or less, the ruler was part of the culture. But in Iraq and Iran, no, they adopted Islam and they had their own dynasties, which had and this new culture had a mix of the Mongol culture and the Muslim culture, and so it was the dominant culture up to the point where the Soviets came, I think, or something like that. And so, yeah, I think this was an example of cultures mixing between the ruler and the ruled.
And to what extent? I mean, I'm not very familiar with that region. I mean, how much knowledge and heritage was lost when the Mongols took over? I mean, is that something historians write about? I mean, obviously a lot, but in the hearts of people, in the way people lived.
The Mongol invasion of Asia was, of course, it was a catastrophe. It was devastating. I mean, I think when I don't remember the writer. I think it was Ibn Kathir or someone like that. He essentially wrote that the Mongol invasion of the Muslim lands was like, I'm now writing the obituary of Islam, Na'yul Islam. Who would want to write that? Because it is, such was the degree of devastation that entire cities were razed and books were burned or thrown into rivers, and we all know the famous stories. I mean, Bukhara, Samarkand, Maru, Baghdad, those were all beacons of light. And I do not say this in an exaggerating or because I'm a Muslim and I'm just trying to project power in our past. No, these were facts on the ground. These cities were beacons of science and light in their day. And so they were all raised into to the ground. Again, going back to the point by Ibn Khaldun about the Badaw and the Hadara, that the people of the desert are hardened. And the Mongols were very, very hardened people. And those cities were extremely sophisticated in terms of life and luxuries and so on and so forth. And so they couldn't resist the overwhelming power of the Mongols. And so, yeah, a lot of knowledge was lost, and to the point that the Muslim scientists, the ulama, they said that we are now going to close Bab al-Ijtihad. We're not going to think about new fiqh right now because we want to sustain the social fabric, and we want to keep things as they are and to preserve the ummah as much as we can. And some of the beaconing of light transferred from Central Asia to the Levant and to Egypt, especially because it was the last stronghold for Islam back then, and it wasn't invaded by the Mongols. And so, the culture, the cultural powerhouse, you can say, shifted from Central Asia and from Iran and Iraq and westwards towards Cairo. To what extent it affected the knowledge itself, it's the closing of Bab al-Ijtihad and the transfer of the powerhouse of culture. I don't know much details about that. Much more details about that, I mean.
Yeah, thank you, brother. That was quite helpful, actually. I suppose we can talk a little bit about the colonial rule. I mean the rule is probably not the best way to describe it. The colonial subjugation of Muslim lands is it is closer to the present day. I mean, obviously, we know that whenever the new ruler takes over, they do change things a little bit, even if it is in the form of soft power. They impose certain values. They change the language, or they alter something in the fabric of the society. So, to what extent did Muslim lands change under colonial rule, for example? Because I guess that's we can relate the most to that example.
You mean modern colonial rule, or?
Yeah, I'm talking like 18th, 19th, 20th century.
Well, I mean, speaking from my own experience here in Egypt, I mean, there were certain topics that were not even subject to discussion before colonial rule that suddenly came to the forefront because the colonizers assumed that they knew everything. Of course, they knew nothing, and that they wanted to, and that they had their mission to this mission to enlighten, so to speak, the colonized lands, and to force them to their own way of life and their own social norms. And so, topics about, in Islam, a man is allowed to marry four women under certain conditions. Women have modest wear. It's not very It's not looked very kindly upon, or it's frowned upon, to wear different or a bit revealing clothes or something like that. And we have that in certain cases, and not all cases, a man would inherit twice as much as a woman if they have the same father and mother, and the father died, for example. So topics like these would go up in flames, essentially, and all of this happened immediately after the colonizer left, because during their time colonizing this or that country, they would make it their mission to attack these givens, let's call them, and they would say that, oh my God, how do you not allow women to go out and wear that kind of thing or this kind of thing, or why do you not allow women to inherit as much as men, or how is it possible that a man can get married to four women at once, or and essentially devastating the social fabric of the society, because after that people would not really understand what's the source of their conviction. Is it the norms that were brought by the colonizer, who had been devastating, culturally speaking, their social norms for as long as they were colonized, different examples across the region, or their own social norms that have been deeply, deeply, deeply carved and maligned because of the colonizer, and that were now being advocated by the religious elite, who are fighting, waging a war against these social norms that were brought by the colonizer, and thinking that they are now in a very tight corner. And so I would say that this dissociation and this confusion and this feeling of being lost immediately after the colonizer left, because I mean 20 to 30 years later things started again to return back to normal. I mean, people return to religion, or return to being in middle, like in the middle nation. But immediately or during the colonizer, no, it was very there was a sense of being lost, a sense of being, I don't know what to do. Where do I? What's my moral ground? What's my cultural ground?
And is there a way to compare that to what we have today, where these big superpowers, through trade, through soft power, through cultural pressure, can change the way entire nations think about themselves and think about the world.
You mean other than the West, of course?
Oh,
You're talking
but
about
the West
China
is the main culprit, right? But
you're talking about China and Russia and those.
yeah, I mean, like, because obviously in the case of the West, we're talking primarily Europe and the United States. You know, whenever and we talked about this in previous content talks. Whenever they give aid, it is always with strings attached. You know, like, can we notice that in the workings of other countries, Muslim countries? You mentioned, you know, Asian countries as well.
I'm not sure I have much information about that. I do not believe that those countries, those superpowers, are forcing some cultural norms in exchange for the aid that they are giving, much like the West does. And I think Brother Shahid can may be able to expand upon that much more. But I do not believe that China, for example, would put conditions on any country that it makes trade with, that it trades with, that you have to be Buddhist or something like that. They simply know, and it's within their within their scope that you have your culture and I have my culture, and as long as we do business together and no one is harmed, then so be it. I don't need to force you to do something. If you do come to my country, then you have to comply with my culture, and that is normal everywhere in the world. But this projection or forcing of culture upon remote countries, and the feeling that I have the burden of enlightening others, I do not believe that those new superpowers or emerging superpowers have that philosophy.
Well, I think that if you're talking about China, for example, they definitely don't have the same domination approach as the West, as America or Europe, but they are a very insular nation. They're very insular, and yet they are reaching out to different parts of the world, and they are interacting with other cultures. They themselves would like to interact with other cultures as little as possible, even when they're doing that in another country. So they generally do have a sort of a hands-off and an indifference to whatever your culture is. It's similar in a way to the expansion of Islam, where we weren't really interested in whatever your cultural practices are within your country, whatever your etiquette is, whatever your traditions are, as long as they don't contradict with Islam. So when Muslims expanded, you see that many sort of localized customs and localized traditions and localized cultures remained. And that's the case until today. That's why people talk about there isn't a monolithic practice of Islam or observance of Islam around the world. There's all different cultural practices, urf, that have been allowed to continue. I think the Chinese are very much this way as well. It has more to do with the fact that they're just very insular with regards to their own culture. Now, it has to be considered, though. I don't know if this is really touches upon anything from Ibn Khaldun, but the Chinese are investing in countries that have already been ransacked by the West. So it's not as if the Chinese are now interacting with already sovereign, powerful, whole independent countries. They're dealing with countries that have already been ransacked, have already been pillaged, have already been weakened, and will maybe already even have an instinct to placate and to appease and to be obsequious with a more powerful player in their country. So not necessarily the Chinese will require that, but it is something that is a learned reflex of oppressed people to try to deal with a powerful force that has come into your country that's more powerful than you and that's very important to you, for example, to deal with them in a potentially an obsequious way. I don't think the Chinese are requiring that of anybody, but I think that overall it's definitely healthier. It's definitely less aggressive. It's definitely less there's less erasure of a local culture as a result of the approach that the Chinese are taking. But there's the sort of indirect cultural changes that will happen as a result of, for example, you have more people who can speak Mandarin in Africa than you ever had before. People learning Mandarin because again, the Chinese are very insular. So if you want to deal with them, it's extremely beneficial if you can speak their language. So these kinds of things will happen, and then trying to understand the Chinese culture will happen. To what you can argue to what extent that represents a compromise in your own culture, just trying to understand and relate to a more dominant society. But from what I have seen, I don't believe that the Chinese are really trying to enforce any particular cultural changes on any of the countries in which they're investing. And Allahu Alam.
So I suppose we can actually talk a little bit about the value of generalizing. Because when Ibn Khaldun says, we need to understand the differences among nations, places, etc. And he goes on to say about character qualities, customs, obviously as well. So to some extent, I suppose, we must generalize. Now, this word generalization, from what I can see, has a lot of negative connotations in contemporary discourse, right? Like we are constantly told not to generalize, to approach every individual as an individual, right? So, how much value is there in generalizing people, nations, and how important is it in studying history?
Well, I mean, in this modern world, I'm not sure if generalizing would suffice, because we now have the structure, the political structure itself is different. You cannot say that you have a certain rule or law that you have to apply, that you can apply to everything and everyone. I mean, I myself find it extremely difficult to have this, steps that I can walk through and reach a certain conclusion, because the variables the variables are simply so many, and uh, the differences between nations, the Asian nations within themselves, China, Malaysia, Indonesia. I know they have this Asian, the Asian way of life, like the hardworking peoples, honest, and so on and so forth. But that's as far as you can go. Each country has its own conditions, and which are affected by the religion of this country, the society of the people living in this country. Colonization, of course, played its own part. And the same thing can even be said about the Middle East right now. I mean, the Khalij lead a way of life that's different from the Levant, different from Egypt, different from North Africa. And so these cultures, they were already different before the advent of the colonizer. And after the colonizer left, again, they even evolved in a much different way. So I'm not sure if generalizing is even a suitable tool right now. Historically speaking, you could generalize some cultures, some cultural norms, some military tactics or military campaigns that this nation did or did not do. But I think Marshall Hodgson used to say that even historically speaking, in the spectrum of cultures, you have to be you have to give every civilization a bit of uniqueness. You cannot simply brush them all with the same brush, because they did have major differences between them. And so you had to study each culture in relation to other cultures, and You have to treat it as a unique culture. You cannot generalize.
I personally, I think generalization is inevitable. It's unavoidable. I think the question, Brother Nail, itself is a bit too general. Um, it depends on it depends obviously on how you're using it. If it's an informed generalization, which is basically the same as collating data and arriving at an average, and saying that, based on multiple experiences, multiple studies, multiple research, and significant research and so forth, this is generally true of this people, or this is generally true of this nation, this is generally true of this so-called civilization, what have you. Uh, I don't think it's something that can be avoided, but obviously it has to be. Ibn Khaldun himself makes many generalizations throughout his book about different peoples. I mean, one thing stands out. It's been a long time actually since I read Muqaddimah. It was probably 20 years or more. I remember him talking about people of hotter climates tend to be a certain way, tend to have a certain approach to life, and tend to be have a certain attitude and personalities and so forth, and character traits and so on. This is a massive generalization. Obviously, in any in any generalization that you use, there will be exceptions. But I think it's inevitable, and it's the way that we generally approach life anyway, is through sort of generalizations about people from different countries or different nationalities and so on. I think it's inevitable, but you have to. It has to be an informed generalization. It has to be based on information and not based on a lack of information or lack of experience and just propaganda, for example. And you always have to leave room for exceptions. But I don't think that it's possible to actually approach life without operating in some way or another on the basis of generalizations.
Yeah, I think because it relates to the fact that we like to label things. We as human beings, I mean, we like to put things in order, and in order to put things in order, we have to have certain boxes and to put each and everything in a certain box so that we can interact with this or that thing or this or that culture. And so we have this very fitra of tending to look for the similarities and saying, okay, so we can make this or that general statement. And the very few are the people who actually have a keen eye for the differences, for the subtle differences, and say that, okay, while this or that is a general statement, but you have to be aware, or you have to be careful that this culture is different from that culture in the terms of this and that aspect of social norms, and so on and so forth.
Sure, absolutely. I mean, I can just give you sort of an example of a generalization that is true, and then a generalization that is not true, and that was thought to be true and became a mistake. There was an Egyptian who went to Singapore, and he thought, because he's Egyptian, but he grew up in the West. He grew up in America. Growing up in America made him think everybody likes hamburgers. This is just the thing that everybody likes. There's no one who doesn't like hamburgers. So he started a hamburger place, all what do you call, organic ingredients and so forth. And it was like real hamburgers, not McDonald's. It was like proper burgers. And his business completely failed because that's not the cuisine that people like in the region. Everybody in the region, a generalization that is true is that everybody likes to eat rice. They like to eat chicken. They like eggs. They like these kinds of foods. And your generalization that everybody likes burgers is maybe a true generalization in America, and it would work there, but it's not a generalization that works here. And the generalization here is that everybody eats rice, and they like it, and they're not looking for something different. So, I mean, you do have to make generalizations, but again, they have to be informed generalizations.
Thank you for the insights. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, whenever I read, and this might be a bit off topic, but whenever I read novels written by, authors of the past, I actually come across many stereotypes and generalizations and whatnot, which is fine for a novel, right? But if you want to engage in historical discussions, then obviously you have to take everything with a grain of salt. I'd like now to move to what I think would be a nice final point to discuss. It doesn't have to do much with the nature of of history, and I mean it's not particularly relevant to this segment, but the author does briefly mention how important is group feeling. I think the Arabic term is asabiyyah, right? For a particular dynasty to thrive and to rule well over a nation, and how the nation that loses that group feeling ultimately fails and succumbs to external pressure. The example he gives is the late stage Arab states in Spain, right? And he mentions that they lost that group of feeling, and they became completely subservient to their Spanish, at that time neighbors, and de facto rulers. So I mean, we are taught today, and looking at it, I mean, most of us received in some way or another, a type of Western education. We are told that tribalism is bad, and how we should abandon that group feeling and think for ourselves. How can we? I mean, how do we understand the importance, or is it important to have this group feeling in one nation? And is it the same as nationalism, as deranged patriotism and whatnot?
Yeah, well, asabiyyah in Ibn Khaldun's words, it has a lot of baggage, so to speak. So I think he mentioned that Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan radiallahu anhu wardah, and the Umayyads, they did succeed in coming to power because they had a strong asabiyyah. And so we have to, in my opinion, we have to compare or to look to asabiyyah from the lens of Islam. And so Islam would say that you have to preserve the status quo and to preserve the ummah no matter what happens. And that's regarding to the question regarding that should we think for ourselves or resort to tribalism. So from an Islamic perspective, the ummah and the nation has to be preserved at any cost. And so, if the people who have the who can preserve the ummah or have the means to preserve the ummah, militarily speaking, or whatnot, are a certain tribe or this or that tribe, then so be it. But we have to remember that this was not the case in early Islam. In early Islam, the Khilafah Rashida, Sayyidina Abu Bakr, Sayyidina Umar, Sayyidina Uthman, Sayyidina Ali, they were all from different tribes. It's true that they were from Quraysh, but that's as far as it went. I mean, they were not related to each other in close relations. To each other, they referred to each other as Sahabat Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and that was it. So the man who was well placed to rule, he came to power, and that was it. But of course, because times changed and because people changed and society changed and societal norms changed and so and whatnot, it became difficult to select a man in power that he did not have asabiyyah behind him, and such was the case such was the example of Sayyidina Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan radiallahu anhu, that because he knew that Bani Umayyah were strong and the Ahl al-Sham knew that Bani Umayyah were strong, and so they came to power, and they had a very good term of power in the 20 years of Sayyidina Muawiyah's rule. And so I find it a bit difficult to understand that this was the case in Spain, because I don't believe that it was a lack of asabiyyah on the part of the Muslim or Arab rulers of Spain. Rather, it was simply that they didn't have the military resources to fight off the Spaniards, and when there was a military power that was powerful enough to stand up to the Spaniards, of course, I'm talking here about the Murabitin in Morocco and in North Africa. they could stave off the Spaniards, and Al-Andalus was saved for another maybe 400 or 300 years. And so it was not asabiyyah per se. It was just, simply having the military resources, and that was it. So it could also be argued that the Murabitin had the asabiyyah, of course, but it's not only the asabiyyah, it's the military resources. That's the point I'm trying to make. They had a very powerful army, and the Arab rulers and the Spaniards didn't have that powerful army. That's it.
Is there a way to think about the importance of belonging to a group different? I mean, today when we talk about different nation states, we often stress out how harmful it can be to think in terms of national interests and of preserving only your nation. But I mean, when it comes to studying history and the various empires, dynasties, rulers, etc., is there benefit to having? Well, I suppose maybe that word group feeling is a bit vague, but what I'm trying to say is that how important is it to have people united under the same banner, having the same values, and resisting the ideas and values of the others. I mean, in this case, it can be their enemies, I suppose. From what I know about history of Andalus, of Muslim, what we know as Spain today, is that there were a bunch of, toward the end, there were a bunch of states that fought each other, even employing the services of Christian mercenaries, states as well. So can we talk about unity as a type of asabiyyah, or does it have, linguistically, a very narrow meaning?
I think that comparing modern nation states to old dynasties and empires would be inaccurate, because nation states are a very they are very constructed entity. You have to put in a lot of resources and a lot of propaganda and a lot of there are so many factors that are synthetic to the process of making a nation state, and I don't think this was the case in pre-modern empires and dynasties. It was a bit more spontaneous and a bit more organic. I mean, I think Brother Shahid can expand more on that later on, but what I'm trying to say is that even though the word unity can be used up or brought up here and there, that the Muslims need to unite and the Muslims need to do this and that, it really doesn't matter if you're a nation state or an empire or a dynasty, because Realpolitik will always remain Realpolitik, no matter the status quo. And so some Muslim rulers would make mistakes, some Muslim rulers would. A lot of factors are to be considered, like the resources at hand, whether or not they have the Ummah's interest as a priority. I mean, those same Muslim rulers you were speaking about in Spain, at some point they did actually unite. The instance I'm talking about of the Murabitin was an instance of the Muslim rulers feeling that they were being extremely overwhelmed by the Spaniards, and that they were being pushed southwards out of the Iberian Peninsula, and so they sent messengers to the Murabitin in North Africa and asked them for help. And they, for the first time, those are the Muluk al-Tawa'if you're referring to, and for the first time, the Muluk al-Tawa'if did actually unite with the Murabitin, and they fought a famous battle against the Spaniards, and they won. And so the status quo in Spain was preserved, as I mentioned, for another 300 years. So again, the word itself is appealing, that the Muslim unity has to be achieved. But I think Realpolitik at the end of the day wins, because those same Muluk al-Tawa'if, after a while, they reverted back to infighting between each other, and the Murabitin had to take over the Iberian Peninsula, or the portion of the Iberian Peninsula that was Muslim, and they had to essentially remove them from power.
Well, I think that, in my opinion, the whole issue of group feeling or asabiyyah or what have you is, the mistake is if it becomes the source of your identity rather than just an organizing principle for society or for multiple societies. I mean, our identity is Islam, our identity is Muslim, our identity and our total group is the Ummah. Subsets of that are going to be different types of groupings, whether that's according to so-called ethnicity, like say the Malays, the Arabs, the Chinese, Africans, Somalis, Egyptians, what have you. And I don't think that it's necessarily a problem when it is an organizing principle where there are people who have common interests, real world interests, shared common interests between them because of shared history, shared geography. They're on the same territory, they have the same past, and they're dealing with they're all within one economy, for example, and so they all deal with that. And then within that, you have another type of group feeling, which is something that I've talked about before, which has to do with the sort of traditional authority structures in any given society that will originate in most traditional societies, in most Muslim countries. It will originate from families and clans and tribes, and the authority structure will be built out of that. So you'll have a mukhtar, a tribal chief. You'll have a sultan. You'll have a king, or what have you, an emir, who has come up through a very large family, and serves the interests of that clan or that tribe, and then it's the biggest one, and then they become the largest and the most important. This is what, like Brother Amr was talking about, this sort of organic creation of group feeling that's not arbitrary, it's real. And this is why, for example, so-called democratic system that they have in the West, where I've done a few videos about that, talking about it being a society of strangers, where you have people from all over the world with all different histories, all different backgrounds, all different cultures, all different ideologies, all different moral values, and so forth, all supposed to be coming together in this very unnatural conglomeration of a society. That's not the case in other parts of the world. It's not the case necessarily across most of the Muslim world, where you have people with shared history, common history, and even family ties, and so an organic structure, an organic system is built of authority. And if you demolish that and say we have to have a democracy, either it's going to actually undermine the government, undermine the real authority of the government and the ruling structure, or else, and then this is actually sort of part and parcel of that, people will vote, even if you have democratic elections, they'll vote along tribal lines. So there's not a way to really avoid the non-arbitrary group feeling that exists in very very old societies that have formed these authority structures and these group identities, or these group feelings, rather, I should say, in an organic way and over the course of really centuries. But if that group feeling becomes the identity that supersedes their identity as Muslims, then this is when it becomes a problem, when it's no longer just an organizing principle for the society in a way that you organize things and run the affairs of the society, and it becomes rather your supreme identity is that you are from this tribe or that tribe or what have you, or you're this nationality and so forth. Then this can become a problem. But as an organizing principle, I don't see that it's not only do I not see that it's a problem, but I think it's quite useful.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I have a feeling that throughout the book we will encounter this discussion, maybe in some different shapes in the future, because I mean we are still in the introduction, and this was supposed to be just a short discussion about how history ought to be talked about, discussed, and studied. With that said, I think we can end our meeting here, as we have exhausted the contents of the first section. For next week, we are supposed to discuss book 1 of the Kitab al-Ibar, which has to deal with the nature of civilization, Bedouin and settled life, the achievement of superiority, etc., and so forth. So, if you have any, further comments, please leave them in the Telegram discussion group, and I hope to see you all next week. Assalamu alaikum.